Hello and welcome to Todos Somos Marcos. Going into the second year producing this show, we've covered a lot about the rebellion in Chiapas, what the Zapatistas have to say to the rest of the world, and how the problems that they address and they raise are widely applicable throughout in our own community and throughout the world. My guest today has approached a lot of these same problems from a slightly different angle, and I'm very happy to welcome Michael Novick. Michael.
Hi, Peter. Nice to be with you.
Hi.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks. Now, Michael, teacher and author and a community activist, has written a book, White Lies, White Power, The Fight Against White Supremacy and Reactionary Violence. We're going to be talking about this a little bit more. And he's the editor, is that right?
Yes,
of Turning the Tide, a quarterly publication of a group called People Against Racist Terror. Why don't we start with that? Can you tell me about that group?
Okay, yeah, PART is about 10 years old now. We were originated here in Southern California, really in a kind of reactive way, responding to a lot of Nazi bonehead violence that was beginning to take place, and just the appearance of a whole new generation of young people who were being drawn into racist circles. And in particular, a man named J.B. Stoner came out here to California. Name might be familiar to people. He was one of the people convicted in Birmingham, Alabama, of church bombings in the period of the Civil Rights Movement, and had been a fugitive for quite a long time, was apprehended finally, and then imprisoned. And upon getting out of prison, announced plans for a national tour on the theme that AIDS was God's gift to the white man.
Oh, no.
He wanted to come out here and organize Nazi boneheads and other young people attracted to racist politics. So we put together PART at that time. I had been doing a little opposition research on some of these groups and got wind of what was up. And we called for a demonstration and had about 1,000 people came out in Glendale, California, to oppose this righteously and rightfully.
Sure.
So, and the group has existed since then. Been up and down a little bit, but we have a pretty strong presence now, and we've been working also with a lot of young people nationally in a network that's called ARA, Anti-Racist Action, and there are a number of chapters of ARA being started up now around the area, mostly to the north and south. Some people down in San Diego interested in starting a chapter, and then also a couple of functioning chapters up in the Santa Barbara area, up to San Luis Obispo.
Well, Michael, when I first started to see Turning the Tide, and you know, I think the first time I picked it up might have been when I went to hear Deutsch, the head of the CIA, speak in South Central last year. My first reaction is that you're talking about such a small lunatic fringe group when you talk about these Nazi skinheads and the flagrant racists, that I wondered why we should pay attention to that. But after reading your book and thinking of it more, I began to see that possibly this is like the tip of the iceberg, in the sense that although they represent the most archaic and flagrant form of racism, the other extreme, to say that racism is not a force in our society, is not at all realistic.
Right. Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is that we don't focus exclusively on just the neo-Nazi groups. We try to look at it in terms of a perspective about what in the fabric of our society continues to sort of reproduce this generation after generation. You would think that kind of everybody would realize what a bankrupt ideology, as you say, that racism is, and how preposterous white supremacy is at this point in human development.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, in the face of the complete irrationality of it, somehow economic and other social forces keep producing that manifestation. So we try to look at it, particularly not even with those people, not so much in terms of finger pointing look at those horrible Nazis with the armbands and the pointy heads and so on, but really where is this manifestation coming from? And I think one of the things that we see is that deeply rooted in our society and globally is this concept of colonialism, of imperialism, that we think really generates the racist ideology and the racist practices of.
In the sense that that racism developed along with European colonialism as a justification for policies that were, at least you could make a good case that they're demonstrated, that they're prompted by the desire to have people's stuff, their land, their
Absolutely.
cheap labor, to make them your slaves, servants, and subjects.
Right. If you look at the development of some of these ideologies, they're very, very conscious, and also the legal justification. You know, the period in which there is anti-colonial uprisings by oppressed people is when you find that the laws get written that reinforce all that white supremacist ideology, particularly in our history. If you look at you know, for example, obviously this show focuses a lot on Mexico, and the history of our this country is bound up on territory that once was part of Mexico.
Yes.
And so a lot of people, for example, don't recognize some of the connection between the U.S. Civil War and the prior Mexican-American War. And many of the generals, for example, Ulysses Grant was an officer in the U.S. Army during the Mexican-American War, and later wrote that it was one of the most shameful periods of his life because of the aggression of the United States against a relatively defenseless country.
Yeah.
And Abraham Lincoln, for example, spoke out in Congress against the declaration of war. I think he even voted against the declaration of war on Mexico, but then proceeded to support funding to carry the war out, unfortunately. But one of the things that did happen in that period of time is that, and that people don't recognize, is that the impetus for the annexation of Texas and then the drive to take the territory from Mexico was that Mexico, in proclaiming its independence, unlike the United States, had abolished slavery.
That's right.
The expansion of slave forces of the South had their eye on that territory and fomented this idea of Texan independence.
No, I didn't catch anything like that in the John Wayne movie.
No, you don't see too much of that. But you know, no, Mexico had invited Anglos to come and become Mexicans, to accept the Mexican Constitution and the principles, and people claimed that they were doing so, but then immediately began this sort of seditious campaign to bring slavery into the Mexican territory.
That's right.
And then the impetus in the United States, once the Mexican War happened, you know, the great struggle of that time between the North and the South, supposedly, was over the expansion of slavery, which was into the territories they had just taken from Mexico. And so the South felt that Lincoln, who was not opposed to slavery per se, but was opposed to the expansion of slavery into Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, California, you know, that this was going to throttle the slave system, which depended on new territories. And so that contradiction became so sharp at that point that the war ensued.
Okay, now, we fought the war, the Civil War, slavery was abolished. The Latin American countries won their independence from Spain. So colonialism and racism sort of disappeared after that, right?
Well, we would wish it were so. I mean, one of the things that is interesting is that exactly that point that the slave owners were expropriated, and that the slave system, which, you know, had been the law of the land not only in the South but throughout the United States, there was no place that a fugitive slave could any longer be free. Once that was broken by the slave uprising during the Civil War, many slaves joined the Union Army, and finally, for political reasons, emancipation being proclaimed, and then to reintegrate the southern states, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, abolishing slavery and granting citizenship to the freed slaves and so on. That's the exact point at which the Ku Klux Klan emerges as an organization in our history. Up to that point, it had just been state power which reinforced all those things.
That's
now the sort of expropriated former Confederate soldiers, former rebels and plantation owners had to create this sort of paramilitary clandestine force to carry out that same policy, eventually resulting in compromises that allowed them to regain state power with the crushing of Reconstruction.
Right, like Plessy versus Ferguson and all the late 19th century developments that institutionalized a racist system.
Exactly.
And which probably went far to guaranteeing low-wage labor,
it's
permanent underclass.
In that same period, you see the development of this, you know, overseas empire then that begins to redevelop. The United States went to war with Spain. We didn't fight in Spain. We fought in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. You know, kind of the last gasp of the old colonial system, really, because, as you say, Latin America was independent, and throughout the world into the 20th century, we've seen increasing numbers of countries gaining their independence from the old British Empire, the old French Empire, the Turkish Empire. And in fact, every empire in the history of the world we've seen has crumbled. And so the United States, unfortunately, has tried to model itself on that whole history of Western empires going back to Rome and Greece and so on. And I think that the danger to us in this society is that we're going to crumble in that same way unless people begin to create non-colonial relations between people and begin to develop solidarity that can maybe create a better world.
Well, I think so too. You know, a lot of times though, when I talk to people in a similar vein, and I really believe what you just said, that we have to find, that our challenge now is to find non-colonial and non-racist ways to move, to move forward to a world where we can always strive for justice and for equality. But they say, "Oh, you're dreaming. That's not realistic. That's not in man's nature." And,
well, I think that really is the only thing that is realistic. I mean, in the sense that we see the consequences and the costs of the kind of nature that's promoted by empire and by empire building. And hardly is it true that most people are empire builders. Most people want to live decent lives with their families and to live at peace with each other. And it's the empires that have created the wars and created the atrocities and the pain that so many people suffer from. So,
and do you see that there's a way for people to build these non-colonial, these anti-empirical ways in their own lives, in their own communities?
Well, I think so. Like, for example, you talked about Chiapas and the whole struggle of the Zapatistas, and I think that one of the issues that we've dealt with in this country, for example, is the militia movement, and there are a wide diversity of forces in the militia movement.
Yeah.
Many of which claim they're against the New World Order, and in fact, there was a man in Colorado recently who claimed he was trying to open up ties with the Zapatistas.
That's
and
right.
felt that neoliberalism.
That, yeah.
The problem is that there's a lot of confusion in there and a kind of bait and switch that goes on. One of the things that happens is that many of these militia forces are actually promoting the same kind of politics that the New World Order puts forward: privatization of all the public land, intensive resource extraction.
That's right.
So we've gone to them with the challenge that if you're really against NAFTA and the New World Order, you should be out there supporting the Zapatistas and supporting the struggle of the EZLN, which was one of the first forces that really emerged in this New World Order as it existed in the wake of the adoption of NAFTA, and that people in this country who are beginning to realize that they're living in an empire. Many of them, particularly in some of these movements which have been influenced by white supremacist thinking, want to draw a line and say, well, I'm a true citizen. They have this line that they're the white citizens or the pre-14th Amendment citizens, or that the Mexicans or the immigrants should be excluded. And I think what people need to realize is that if you live in an empire, everyone is a subject. Yeah. You can't draw that distinction between the subject peoples out there and then somehow, because we live here at home, we're the citizens. And I think that if people can begin to see that and recognize that, it lays a real basis for solidarity and for unity and for taking up some of the things that have been called for.
Not only that, but in the 16th century, people could talk about, subject, and in the 17th and the 18th, and about their destiny to rule, and onward for church and the king.
Right, and
but
manifest
today
destiny.
Most people don't believe that anymore. I think most people, at least most people that I know, I think if you really talk to them about it, they do believe in, equality and justice for all. They don't necessarily want to give up their inflated share of the pie, but I think that theoretically it's hard to sell them on the idea that you can have a subjected class anymore.
Well, I think there's a fundamental schizophrenia in American thinking, and someone once said the average white American believes that all men are created equal and that blacks are inferior, and I think there is something to that. If you look at the whole ideology that has directed the development of this country, on the one hand there's a libertarian or a liberatory kind of thinking about human rights and everybody should be free and equal. On the other hand, there is this impulse towards conquest and towards manifest destiny from sea to shining sea, and even in the flag, it embodies that reality or duality that you have the 13 stripes representing the original kind of small fragmented colonial groups that claimed they were throwing off the yoke of colonialism, and then you have the 50 stars saying, okay, well, now that we've, decolonized,
That's a really good point.
from England, we're going to, recolonize everything else. And it is, if you look at even the Declaration of Independence, some of the complaints they had against England was that England was signing treaties with the indigenous people, guaranteeing and protecting the lands that the colonists wanted to take from the Indians. And one of their complaints against King George is that he was, not putting down what Jefferson described as the merciless savages, And
That's right.
so, I think that until we can really resolve that contradiction in our own thinking and in our practice, we keep repeating these errors. We keep, getting new manifestations like Nazi boneheads or like the anti-immigrant hysteria we're seeing here in California.
Well, what, if anything, besides the constant, concern and vigilance of people who believe in a progressive future, are there things that we need to do to really seriously put these shames behind us? Like reparations?
Well, yeah, I think that
like that.
reparations and self-determination are very, very important. I'm involved, for example, and part is with the Crack the CIA Coalition. And the Crack the CIA Coalition is looking at one particular sort of set of atrocities carried out by the CIA, not only in terms of the CIA involvement in drug distribution in this country and internationally, but also the CIA role in human rights abuses in this country and around the world. And, people recognizing the problem that there is no way to sort of hermetically seal off the subject people from the citizens, that crack has spread throughout our society, not only to the areas maybe where the CIA felt it was advantageous to them to have it as a kind of counterinsurgency method, but in every suburban home there's, you find drug problems now. And so I think this is an object lesson to people that also the way to solve the problem is to begin to build some real solidarity and to recognize that the racism that divides people is one of the key props of the system that is destroying so much of everyone's lives. And I think that that holds out some hope. I think the other side of it is that in terms of the Crack the CIA, that some aspect of a disillusionment is very, very important. That the important thing, though, is not to be lost in cynicism. In other words, we've had a lot of illusions about, the bastion of freedom and the role the United States plays, and so to lose those illusions, I think can be a very positive and necessary step. But the problem is, I think that people then become cynical and hopeless and throw up their hands and say, what can you do about it? And I think that, beginning to do for example, the Crack the CIA Coalition is building ties with forces in Mexico. We're planning to hold a joint educational program and press conference within a couple of months in Tijuana with forces from the Civic Democratic Movement and the labor movement in Mexico, because we see that the power of the CIA as it operates in Mexico, which is not, in fact, to eradicate drugs, but to use the drug war as an excuse to attack the Mexican people, is the same problem we're facing in this country.
Don't you think that the whole drug war is an extension of colonialism, both in the world, in the producing nations, and in our own communities, extending the power of the state and the police far into individuals? Wouldn't we be much better off if we just let people have their drugs if they wanted them and treat them when they...
Well, definitely, I think the treatment, emphasis on treatment would be much better than the current mechanism. I mean, one of the things I outline in the book is really the colonial nature of the criminal justice system in this country. And the drug war has been one key way that's been propagated into the last decades of this century, in which really mass incarceration of black and Latino youth is taking place. Communities were deindustrialized, people were driven out of the economy and into the black market system or whatever, and then the drugs also provided to them, the guns provided to them, and so it's a setup in that sense. But also I think that the solution to it has to come from the people themselves. In other words, we're not looking for, I think reparations is part of it, and we called for it, but basically we think that people need to in a self-determined way, and I think that's the anti-colonial part of it, that the black community needs to begin to take control of its own destiny. The Latino and Mexicano community needs to, begin to heal itself. And I think that white people also, people talked in the 60s in terms of African liberation from colonialism. Frantz Fanon put out this book called Black Skin, White Masks. in which he said that black people in Africa had internalized the idea that somehow they were Algerian and they were French, or they were, Nigerian and they were Britons because they had been controlled by the empire. But we need to understand that white people are also sometimes in white masks, that we sort of accept this idea that somehow we're identifying with the oppressor or as the oppressor, and that if we can begin to see that under the white masks we're all in fact human, whether our skin is black, white, red, brown, that we have a common interest in divesting from that system and building solidarity. I think that would put us on a road towards maybe greater harmony and also a chance to really survive into the next century.
Well, this is, we've as usual in this 28.5-minute format, we've skirted over the surface and pointed to a lot of important issues that we haven't really had a chance to get into. Why don't you give out the phone number for People Against Racist Terror so that people can get in touch with you? And if you don't get the phone number, check out mine at the end of the show, and we'll get everybody in touch that needs to be in touch. So for people
people can reach People Against Racist Terror. Our slogan is "Be Part of the Solution." Here's a copy of our journal, Turning the Tide. You can reach us at 310-288-5003, or write to us at Post Office Box 1055, 1055, Culver City, California, 90232. And people could get copies of Turning the Tide or might be interested in the book, White Lies, White Power.
Before we go, just a few minutes, well, we don't have a few minutes, but about the Crack the CIA, the big demonstration, February 22nd. I was there. How many people would you say?
The police actually estimated 4,000. That was somewhat more than I counted, but but pretty substantial.
It was a nice it was a good demonstration. There was a lot of people, enthusiasm. Then there was this great rally in front of City Hall, and Maxine Waters and a lot of other knowledgeable and important. I was just shocked. I didn't see anything about it in the LA Times.
Isn't that strange? Isn't that strange? 4,000 people of every racial group in the city, and African, Latino, and we marched around the LA Times. They did not have a word. The only word they ever said was in a column by David Horowitz, slamming it and completely misrepresenting it. We are pursuing the whole question, and definitely this is not going away. The Crack the CIA Coalition is very active. We're going to be doing a program with Dick Gregory very soon. He's coming out to California to support our work. I mentioned we're going to be doing this activity with people in Mexico, and we have a campaign, and definitely if people want to get involved in that, they can call PART at 310-288-5003.
Excellent. My number that will appear at the end of this show. Okay, well, I think that we're pretty close to out of time here, so again, we skimmed the surface. I think we covered, we pointed to some important issues, and I think that I hope that the viewers will get to, some new people will get to know about you and your work.
Thank you.
And,
appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let's end this segment with some video by Ralph Cole of the February 22nd Crack the CIA demonstration in downtown Los Angeles. Watch it now.